My name is General Sir Mark Manns, and the reason I'm here, I was previously the Chief Royal Engineer a few years ago, but I happened to know Martin during that particular period. Now, Martin is well renowned within Sapper historical circles. In fact, he was a sapper himself. I think, Martin, you served in the regular sappers for most of the 1960s, before then jumping ship and working in the NHS. So hard luck. But since then, Martin has been tremendous in researching, writing, and talking about military history in various guises. But he has also been a very, very fine supporter of the Royal Engineers, in particular our museum at Chatham, and also more recently the Royal Engineers Historical Society, which is going strong, very strong. And any of you in the audience who are sappers or just got interest in military engineering, log on to that particular website. They do some fantastic talks, webinars, and also visits. And I'd also say that Martin is wearing the tie, and therefore I'm improperly dressed. He's an Honorary Fellow of the Institution of Royal Engineers. So Martin is eminently well qualified to give us a talk this evening on the Royal Engineers in Farnborough and Aldershot during the 19th century. We look forward to what you have to say.
Right, thank you very much, Mark. Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, I've got to compress 172 years history into about 50 minutes. It's been an interesting challenge. In 1853, the Army conducted major manoeuvres with 2 divisions near Cobham. It was agreed that a permanent location for future training events of this nature was needed. In addition to the Cobham area, the land to the north of Aldershot was also under consideration. The latter area was considered better, particularly since it had a good supply of water, a necessity for both troops and, of course, horses, which figured large at that time. Now, in March 1854, the British had joined the French in sending forces to support the Ottoman Empire, and a very substantial part of the British Army, including the sappers, participated in that war. With the country on a war footing, the militia were called out, and this created an urgent need to provide accommodation for some 50,000 troops. In April 1854, Captain John Cameron of the Corps of Royal Engineers arrived in Aldershot with 24 Royal Sappers and Miners, led by Sergeant Major James MacDonald. They heralded what was to become a continuous sapper presence in the garrison, now represented by 2 Troop of 106 Field Squadron, they're a reserve unit, and also, of course, 3 RSME Regiment just up the road at Minley. Now, in the following 10 months, a total of 24 square miles was surveyed, and a 6-inch map, or scale map, was produced. And incidentally, the Royal Sappers and Miners formed one body with the existing Corps of Royal Engineers on the 17th of October 1856. Up until that time, the Corps of Royal Engineers was officer only. The commanding Royal Engineer in Aldershot was Major General Sir Frederick Smith, and he was instructed by the Board of Ordnance to provide accommodation in huts for a total of 20,000 troops just north of Aldershot village. The layout of the north and south camps is shown on the map. Units began moving into huts by mid-May, but the local people were probably quite alarmed by the arrival of several thousand rough and licentious soldiery. However, the opportunity to make a quick buck resulted in entrepreneurs establishing themselves to the west of the town. Here they offered drink, a somewhat dubious entertainment, I suspect, and opportunities for gambling and such like. And in fact, the 1859 edition of the Hampshire Gazetteer noted that in 1854 there were just 2 beer houses in Aldershot. At the date of its publication, there were 20 taverns and 40 beer houses. It wasn't all bad. Officers wanted accommodation. Married officers in particular wanted accommodation to rent or purchase locally. So there was a positive as well. Now, the electric telegraph was used in the Crimea during the war with a small cadre of Royal Engineers operating it. The Corps recognised the value of this, and to quote its history, had been quietly and unostentatiously preparing for its continued use in the field. And Captain Edmund Duquesne, RE, had been leading this, and a small detachment of sappers was sent to Aldershot in 1856. An overhead wire link was established from each camp to the telegraph office at Farnborough Station. Now, whilst this undoubtedly improved the speed of communication between Army headquarters and the camp, I suspect that quite a few people would rather wish that it hadn't happened because, of course, you could contact them quickly. Therefore, you had to ask them. If it took a long time to contact them, you could do something and tell them what you'd done. So, a mixed blessing. Aldershot was, in modern parlance, now becoming a super garrison. And with the electric telegraph, it joined what I call the Victorian internet. General Smith put forward a design for the permanent barracks. This was approved by Field Marshal Viscount Hardinge, the Commander-in-Chief, and passed, guess who, to Captain Robert Laffan. He was then Deputy Inspector General of Fortifications. He increased the space in the barrack rooms to give 500 cubic feet per man, improved ventilations, added ablutions to each floor, and married men were allocated a room for themselves rather than several families sharing one barrack room. In February 1855, Hardinge sent the revised plan to the Prince Consort for his approval. And it was seen that the Prince Consort was frequently consulted in military matters. Laffan returned to Aldershot in 1866 as the commanding Royal Engineer, when he transformed the appearance of the camp by planting trees and laying down grass. And the old Queen's Birthday Parade ground was renamed Laffan's Plain in his memory. In March 1855, the sum agreed for this work was £250,000. That's around about £40 million today. Now, you know what I'm going to say next. I'm sure you all know what I'm going to say next. The final cost in 1860 had more than doubled. So, cost overruns, well, the Army had been doing it forever. The barracks for the infantry and artillery were completed in August 1856 and were named the Wellington Lines in 1891. They were demolished between 1958 and 1961. Construction of the cavalry barracks followed a year later in 1857, and it was between Beaumont and Willems barracks that a short run of underground track was built to move stores between these sites. There is more about this in a book called Secret Aldershot by Paul Vickers, and I'm grateful to him for letting me use some of his pictures this evening. Now, the ground floor of each barrack provided stabling with troopers' accommodation above, and an officer's mess and quarters were provided, plus the necessary ancillary barracks. Now, I'll just pop back to this slide. If you look at the barrack buildings in the top picture and here, they all look very utilitarian, don't they? Well, you're in for a bit of a surprise. Because this magnificent building is the riding school. Horses were clearly more important when it came to architecture. Now, the entrances to Beaumont and Willems were preserved, and I'm sure some of you see them, maybe some of you see them every day. And the splendid Beaumont Riding School, designed by Laffan, was retained. Historic England notes that it is an exceptional example of the high architectural standards practiced by the Royal Engineers. Now, to give that reference some context, the Royal Engineers have been publishing professional papers on a wide range of military and civil engineering related matters since 1837. And the Institution of Royal Engineers, which several people in this room are members of, I'm sure, the Sappers professional body was founded in 1875 and continues to work very hard and still has a professional journal. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were regular visitors to what became known as the home of the British Army. In 1855, Albert chose a site for the Royal Pavilion on a low hill to the southwest of South Camp. First used in June 1856, a month later, as the Queen was being driven through the camp, her carriage stopped at the barracks occupied by the sappers. She asked their officer, Major Lothian Nicholson, RE, to bring before her some of his Crimean veterans. The Queen was graciously pleased to express herself in terms of great admiration of the devotion shown by this branch of the service. The pavilion was, in 1939, handed over to the Army by King George VI, and in 1962 the late Queen agreed it could be demolished to make way for a training school for the Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps. The site is now in private hands, only the original guard room remains. In June 1859, Prince Albert informed the Major General Jonathan Peel, Secretary of State for War, that he was desirous of presenting a collection of 1,000 books to the officers at the camp at Aldershot, adding that he would also provide a library to house them. The architect for this was Captain Francis Fowke, RE, whose last and greatest work was the general design of the Royal Albert Hall. It was completed after his death by Major General Henry Scott, also of Sapper, in 1870. And if you'd like to see some of the original drawings for the Royal Albert Hall, please do pop up to the Royal Engineers Museum. We've got a superb set of them. Less well known is the fact that in the same year, Queen Victoria gave over 700 books to form the Victoria Soldiers' Library. The Cambridge Military Hospital was opened to patients in 1879. It closed in 1996 and has been converted to private apartments. It was here that the surgeon Harold Gillies carried out his pioneering plastic surgery work in the First World War. His unit was later moved to Queen Mary's Hospital, Sidcup. Oddly enough, I was a patient in Cambridge Military Hospital because I got food poisoning due to bad food provided by, well, never mind who by, but it's by the Army. That will suffice. And I also worked at Queen Mary's Hospital, Sidcup. The Franco-Prussian War broke out on the 16th of July, 1870. And it's fair to say it probably caused some alarm in the War Office. The quiet and unostentatious work of the sappers on the electric telegraph had been formalised the year before when the Signals Wing was established at Chatham. On 24th of August 1870, orders were given to form Sea Troop Signals under the command of Captain Montague Lambert, and the troop moved to Aldershot on the 14th of August 1871, arriving in Aldershot on the 19th. And bearing in mind, this is all horse-drawn, although they did use steam traction engines to help them with some of the journey. The Signals troop was enlarged to form a battalion with 2 signals company, and the RE Signal Service was formed in 1912, and its first commandant was Colonel, later Major General Sir Reginald Curtis. The Signals Wing moved to Maresfield in 1918, where the Royal Corps of Signals was formed in 1920. Now, Sappers were, and indeed are, continue to look for innovations which might be of value to the army. To this end, in 1872, they ordered an experimental railway developed by John Fell be built in Aldershot. It was a lightweight 18-inch gauge system, similar to a modern monorail, and was tested on a 20-mile track over undulating ground around the camp. It was successful, but it wasn't commercially successful, which meant it was not being bought by anybody else. So there was no benefit to the army because it would only be useful if there was rolling stock out there amongst civilian organisations which they could commandeer if they ever needed to use it extensively. Incidentally, and quite appositely, the Board of Trade, who were responsible for approving the various railway schemes, required professional engineering advice. Its railway inspectorate was formed in 1814, and until the late 1960s, the inspecting officers were recruited exclusively from the Corps of Royal Engineers. The first Inspector General was Lieutenant Colonel, later Major General, Sir Frederick Smith. This is a real sapper's sort of task, isn't it? The horse swimming pool, constructed in 1894. Now, I can't say that the sappers did it, but I'm fairly certain they did. Who else would be around in Aldershot to do something like that? It was a rifle range originally, and it was created by damming the valley at Long Bottom, and it was a very popular unofficial swimming place. But unfortunately, a number of soldiers and civilians drowned there over the years. In 1937, it was drained. That definitely done by the sappers. But the dam wasn't wholly destroyed, so it's naturally refilled. And we're certainly known to have held an annual horse swimming demonstration there. And as I say, we probably constructed it. Right, in February 1890, Edward Stanhope, then Secretary of State for War, moved a bill in Parliament to secure funding for the new barracks. Referring to a report he had received from the Duke of Connaught, GOC Aldershot, Stanhope said that the roofs of the huts, which are 35 years old, are flattening down, and the lower frames are rotten, and more than 500 have had to be propped up. £7,000 a year is now being spent on repairs, and that sum is annually increasing and is quite insufficient to keep them in a sanitary condition. The bill was passed, building to replace the wooden huts commenced under the supervision of Royal Engineer Majors Pitt, Noel and Jessup. And rather unusually, they remained in post instead of moving on sort of every 2 to 3 years as was and is normal. They remained in post till the works had been entirely completed, which was probably a good thing, seeing the project right through. Almost all of these buildings came down in the late 50s and early 60s. M and M blocks of Aldenard Barracks in the Marlborough lines were saved and are now part of the Military Museum. Funding from the Barracks Act also provided for the Connaught and Louise Margaret hospitals, the Fox and Maida Museum, gymnasiums, and Wavell House, now HQ of South East District, and other buildings. Gibraltar Barracks, which I've pointed out, lay alongside the canal and housed the Royal Engineers establishment. This was the depot for bridging units and the training school for all drivers of RE-mounted units. It also became the centre for the trials of telegraph equipment and that of field companies and field troops. The canal was useful for bridging and watermanship training. On 30th of May 1910, Charles Claudius de la Poor Beresford, RE, led his men from here as they set off for Christchurch, where we also did water training as well. On the Farnborough Road, the horse ridden by driver Perry bolted, and Beresford attempted to catch them. They collided and both horses and riders crashed to the ground. Beresford's father, also a sapper officer, was summoned and was with his son when he died that afternoon. Now that name may have rung a bell with one or two people, especially if you're interested in Napoleonic period history, because Charles was a scion of the family whose military service extended further back than the Peninsular War. He was buried at Aldershot with full military honours. Sapper Perry, not much said about him, but he was not nearly severely injured and survived and presumably went on serving. The Church of St George was built in 1893 to a design by two Royal Engineers, Major Pitt and Lieutenant Mitchie. In 1973, it was consecrated as the Catholic Church of the Roman Catholic Bishop of the Forces. The final report of the Barracks Act showed that 375 new buildings have been constructed, 228 refurbished, accommodation for 368 officers, over 12,000 other ranks, just 18 nurses, and 558 horses. The Aldershot Military Cemetery was created by the sappers very soon after they arrived in 1855, and we're fairly sure that its chapel was designed by a Royal Engineer as well, and that was built in 1879. In the 1863 issue of the professional papers of the Royal Engineers, there were two papers by Lieutenant George Grover. These gave an account of the history of ballooning and much technical detail about their use. With regard to this, the core history remarks, it was forwarded to the Ordnance Select Committee. Here, as might be expected, the usual dose of cold water was administered without, however, the desired result of suppressing the troublesome engineer. Familiar story, isn't it? Another name that's quite relevant much later on is that of Barnes Wallace, who had cold water poured on his project too. The other paper was by Captain Frederick Beaumont, RE, who had in 1862 managed to attach himself to the American Union Army. He studied their use of balloons in military operations, the practicalities of transporting them, and the supply of oxygen for them. The Confederation also used balloons. Finally, in 1878, after a false start in 1873, authority was given for experimental ballooning work at the Royal Arsenal, Woolwich, and the balloon equipment store was established. It was here that Captain James Templar of the Middlesex Militia joined the team. He was a balloon owner and a well-respected figure of the civilian ballooning fraternity. Together with Major Henry Elsdale, RE, they later led the military balloon training at Aldershot. Next, a tragedy. In fact, something of more than passing interest to me, because I went to school in Wiltshire, primary school at Little Somerford, and subsequently to Malmesbury Grammar School. In 1881, the War Office ballooned Saladin with Templar, together with Walter Powell, an experienced balloonist, and the MP for Malmesbury, and Lieutenant Ag Gardner of the South Wales Borders Militia took off from Bath to carry out meteorological investigations. When over South Dorset, they attempted to land. On hitting the ground, the basket tipped up, and Templar and Ag Gardner both fell out. Templar held on to the balloon's valve line, but was dragged along and it eventually had to let go. Once he did that, the loss of his weight meant that the balloon shot up into the air and just disappeared over the sea. Templar was carried out, Powell was carried out to sea and never seen again. Some cruel people might think that's not a bad fate for an MP, but now, the basket of the hot air balloon in which my wife and I flew also landed on its side, but as is evidenced by my presence, I wasn't killed, nor was anybody else. I think the only injury was to the balloon captain's pride. Oh, and the fence, yes. But the fence wasn't a problem because the balloon captain had a bottle of scotch which he gave to the landowner and the matter was resolved. How many times has a bottle of scotch resolved a problem, I wonder? In 1882, the store was moved to the School of Military Engineering, Chatham, and named the School of Ballooning. And it's here that an important step took place, and that was that the storage and transport of hydrogen compressed into steel tubes was pioneered. This negated the necessity to manufacture hydrogen in the field, which is not a particularly easy task. Now, Lieutenant John Capper, RE, an aeronautical enthusiast, now joined the staff for a couple of years. He'll pop up again shortly. In 1886, Templar personally leased Abbey Court Farm at Lidsing. It was quite a handily place for the Harrow Inn. In later years, this was a regular meeting place for the Royal Engineers draghounds. He rented this land to the War Office, so he got the farm, then rented it to the War Office. Sounds a bit like Bletchley Park, doesn't it? Something similar happened there, I believe. And this was used for the balloon school summer camps. Now, in order to protect the balloon from the elements, a large pit was dug into which the balloon could be tethered and recovered to after a flight. Now, you need a jolly big hole for a 10,000 cubic foot balloon. And I have a feeling that the old chalk pit there in the red box was probably utilised for that purpose. Certainly, reading the history, it doesn't say it in so many words, but it's sort of implied. Major Henry Ellsdale was a pioneer of air photography, and he presented a report to the War Office in 1887 recommending that a permanent ballooning unit be created. This was agreed, and Templar was appointed instructor of ballooning. In 1889, the balloon section was formed within the School of Ballooning. A year later, it was designated the balloon section and depot, and the whole operation was moved to the RE lines in Aldershot in 1891, where the balloon factory and a balloon shed were erected. Now you'll see here that there were now two distinct entities. One was the balloon section and depot, and the other was the balloon factory. Both were under the overall command of Major Templar, and he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in 1897. As Commandant of the balloon section, he reported to the GOC Aldershot. As Superintendent of the balloon factory, he reported separately to the Inspector General of Fortifications, and that person was always the sapper. And indeed, the successor to the Inspector General of Fortifications is now the Chief Royal Engineer. The outbreak of the Boer War in 1899 saw an immediate expansion of the balloon service to 6 sections. 4 sections served in South Africa and another in China. Now, Balloon Square was not a satisfactory place to launch balloons, being an area confined by buildings, so ballooning parties often went out to Long Valley for training purposes, which also took them away from the public gaze. The entire ballooning operation was moved to Farnborough Common in 1906. This included the original balloon shed. 150 sappers were moved to barracks in the North Camp. The 14 officers continued to use the mess in the RE lines. And in 1907, building G1, now known as Trenchard House and the home of the Farce Museum, was constructed, we think, by the sappers. In flying terms, 3 significant developments occurred. Experiments with man-lifting kites, the use of airships, and in 1907, the aeroplane. But first, a court-martial. In the spring of 1906, Templar was relieved of his command on the instructions of Sir John French, GOC Aldershot. This arose in part from the court-martial of Warrant Officer Jolly, one of Templar's subordinates, over certain financial irregularities. I'll tell you more questions if anybody wants to know. Thus, the 30-year career of Templar as the major driving force in military ballooning came to an unhappy end, although he was retained on a consultancy basis for 2 more years. Jolly was found guilty and suffered loss of seniority in rank. Templar's successor was the aforementioned John Capper, now a lieutenant colonel. Capper, on War Office business in USA in 1904, made a personal visit to the Wright brothers at Dayton, Ohio. He made an informal offer to them to come to England to work exclusively for the government for 4 years. Recommending this, on his return home, the proposal was rejected. The War Office had no belief in the practicability of flying. Capper remained in that post until 1909, when a civilian, Mr. Mervyn O'Gorman, was appointed superintendent. O'Gorman was later commissioned. Capper continued as commandant of the balloon school until 1910. He was then posted on, but finished the war as Director General of the newly established Tank Corps in the rank of Major General. Turning now to man-lifting kites. These were devised by the American Wild West showman Samuel Franklin Cody. He arrived in Europe in 1890, claiming to be the son of the American showman William Buffalo Bill Cody. They were not related. Samuel Cody met the French balloonist Auguste Gaudron at the Alexandra Palace. It is thought this was the catalyst for Cody's interest in flight, and he developed the Hargreaves box kite, patenting the various changes he made. And the Cody war kite was officially adopted by the War Office in 1908, and the Royal Navy also used them. At much the same time, Templar began designing a semi-rigid airship, and work on this was continued by Capper and Cody. The outcome being British Army Air Dirigible No. 1, better known as Nulli Secundus, second to none. Its first significant flight was from Farnborough to London on the 5th of October 1907 with Capper and Cody on board. After passing over Buckingham Palace and circling St Paul's Cathedral, they were forced by a strong headwind to moor at the Crystal Palace, Sydenham. And as I was researching on this, I thought there, my grandfather lived in Sydenham, and he was about 19. I wonder if he saw that. He probably did. After all, it was quite a thing, airships then. Damaged by wind, it was dismantled and taken back to Farnborough and rebuilt to become, somewhat strangely, Nulli Secundus II. A small airship named Baby made her maiden flight in 1909. That was rebuilt and enlarged and named Beta, and that was actually used in the Army manoeuvres of 1910. And in the following year, Major Lefroy, RE, took wireless telegraphy equipment on board and established two-way communication with the ground station. However, he wasn't very successful because he had great difficulty in hearing the incoming Morse signal because of the noise of the engines, but it didn't demonstrate its practicability. 16th of October 1908, Cody's aircraft flew 424 metres, and this was recognised as the first powered and sustained flight in this country. So, what happened next? Well, development of military aircraft was stopped, because at £2,500 a year, it was too much. This didn't put Cody off, designated British Army aircraft number 1, the aircraft was given to him, and he continued to build aircraft at his own expense from his shed on Laffan's Plain. And his first passenger was Sapper, who was taken up on 13th of August 1909. On the 7th of August 1913, Cody was flying his new float plane from the Basingstoke Canal, which broke up at 200 feet, and Cody and his passenger, the cricketer William Evans, were killed in the crash landing. Often referred to as Colonel Cody, he held no military rank, but he was buried with full military honours in the Aldershot Military Cemetery. This most important pioneer of flying in this country is remembered with a statue adjacent to FAST and the iconic Cody tree, which was also preserved but eventually replicated in an aluminium casting, which is outside Kinetics HQ. The inscription on the plaque, well, it's on the screen. So I will pause for a drink. In the photograph is then Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Granger, also a fellow sapper, who'd qualified both as a pilot and a parachutist and was attached to the Army Air Corps. And the 1983 RAE journal noted alongside this picture that the long association between the RAE and the Royal Engineers had been re-established on his appointment by the MOD as their senior military advisor. If any of you know Stuart, I'm meeting him, we're having lunch with him tomorrow. He's 90 years old today. Right, the Royal Engineers Air Battalion was formed in 1911, and the balloon factory became the Army Aircraft Factory, and the Air Battalion had 2 companies. Number 1 was responsible for airships, and number 2 for aeroplanes. The formation of the Royal Flying Corps followed in the following year resulted in further changes. Number 1 Airship Company became Number 1 Squadron Royal Flying Corps, and Number 2 Squadron Royal Flying Corps was formed from a detachment of Number 2 Company, and Number 2 Company was redesignated as 3 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. Number 3 Squadron, well, all 3 squadrons continue to exist in the RAF, and Number 3 Squadron's motto is, "The third shall be first," because they maintained that they were the ones who were flying the aeroplanes, whereas 1 squadron was balloons. Yes, I've mentioned that. 1912, the Army Aircraft Factory was renamed the Royal Aircraft Factory, and then on the formation of the Royal Air Force in 1918, it became the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and it's now part of the Defence Research Agency. The formation of the RFC ended the direct link between the Royal Engineers and military aviation. However, members of the Corps drawn from across all ranks continued flying. 3 of them, Captains McCudden and Hawker and Major Mannock, were awarded, each of them was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. The sappers continued to be responsible for provision of landing grounds, aeroplane sheds, workshops, etc., but not barracks. And the buildings indicated in red were on the Farnborough site in 1909, and those in the blue box were built by 1911. The frame of the portable airshed can now be seen a little north of its original location. When it was taken down, the metal framework was used in 2 new buildings on the site, the fabric shop and the RAE forge and foundry. And more recently, when they were being taken down, somebody realised the importance of the metalwork. Might even be somebody in this room, possibly, I'm not sure. But anyway, It was realised the metalwork was salvaged, restored, and there is the portable airship shed. This shows the development of the site from 1914. Circled in green is the portable airship hangar. In the blue circle is the original balloon shed. And of the two white sheds in the yellow circle, only the left-hand one remains and is now known as the Black Shed, for the obvious reason that it's painted black. This was quite an important building. It was designed by Lieutenant Colonel Bertie Armstrong, RE. The roof has an iron reinforced timber truss, which greatly increased the span of the roof, thus giving an open floor plan with no columns obstructing it. And I've circled Trenchard House in red as a point of reference. Searchlights. They had been used successfully by the sappers in South Africa, in the South African War. And they were subsequently used at various events in Aldershot, the Aldershot tattoos. The Royal Engineers Signal Service was based at the RE establishment, together with the wireless telegraph experimental section. And a transmitter in Aldershot provided throughout the war a standard time signal, which could be received overseas, together with transmissions for frequency checking several times a day. At the start of the First World War, on the 4th of August 1914, the RE training depot was responsible for training drivers, horse, RE. Its strength was 3 officers and about 400 other ranks, including trainees. 6 days later, there were 1,800 people on the premises, which placed an enormous strain on the permanent staff, and the accommodation rapidly became overcrowded. All new arrivals had to be kitted out, fed and trained, and the weekly pay parade took 1,800 men, took about 6 or 7 hours. You've got to bear in mind, everybody was paid in cash, and even when I was serving, we were paid in cash, and you formed up in a big line, and you marched up to the table, and you saluted, gave your name, money was laid before you, you checked to make sure it was correct, you signed, you saluted, and off you went. And you can imagine repeating that process 1,800 times would take a little while, wouldn't it? Upshot of this was that there was desperate need for more huts. Seems to be the answer to everything, doesn't it? More huts. And indeed, somebody's actually written a PhD thesis on First World War military huts. It's a sort of a bit of a eclectic thing, I think. But the hutted cap scheme for various camps were designed by Colonel Armstrong, RE, and in the Aldershot Command, huts for 60,000 troops were provided in 1914, with more built as the war progressed. And I say Aldershot Command because I don't think by any means all of them were actually built in Aldershot itself. And the Royal Engineer units listed were mobilised as part of the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. And after the war, these units progressively returned to the town. Incidentally, field squadrons supported the cavalry and field companies supported the infantry. But in about 1959-60, something like that, it was decided that all RE formations would be called squadrons. So, the peace dividend, as I think it's been referred to in more recent times, major rundown of the armed forces. And it was not until early 1939 that the services were able to expand and develop their fighting efficiency again. Prior to the war, the sappers were thought to have placed 2 bridges over the Basingstoke Canal, which were replaced in about 1920. Now, I'm sure some of you will recognise 2 of these, maybe even all 3 of them. The one at Eelmore has now been replaced, and that and the one at Clay Cart are Hopkins bridges. These were designed by Captain Hopkins RE and prefabricated. And they're what I call nuts and bolts bridges. So as you assembled them, each component had to be bolted to the next, and there were an awful lot of nuts and bolts. Clearly not much use in lines on the front line, because they'd take a long time to assemble, and if you drop too many nuts in the water, you wouldn't have enough to make the bridge. But they were used in lines of communication in the First World War, and these two were probably spare afterwards, and somebody said to the sappers, "Can you fix us a bridge, please?" I think that's what may have happened in Gibraltar as well. There's a Hopkins Bridge there. There's also the Ingalls Portable Military Bridge light type, also known as the triangular or pyramid footbridge. And this was designed in 1913 by Major later Sir Charles Ingalls RE, who played a significant role in the development of bridges right through to the Second World War. He worked with Donald Bailey later on, or perhaps I should say Donald Bailey worked with him. Anyway, and this design was developed into a more conventional bridge which could span up to 96 feet and carry tanks. Now, the RE units listed on the screen were mobilised with the British Expeditionary Force, and at least 2 new units were formed in Aldershot. 48 Bomb Disposal Section and 142 RE Officer Cadet Training Unit. 171 Tunnelling Company came down to Aldershot and was deployed in 1940 to construct an underground HQ for Aldershot Command. This was a challenging project, poor ground, which other units completed. And the town also became the main base for the Canadian soldiers who began to arrive in late 1940. The Royal Canadian Engineers were based in the then recently built Southwood Camp, which after the war was occupied by the sappers. Now then, the bomb disposal work was allocated to the Royal Engineers, and on 19th of August 1940, tragedy struck the nascent bomb disposal section, RE number 8 section. They were called to a bomb drop near Hook Station, which had not detonated. As they were digging down to the bomb, it exploded, and sappers Hill, Moxon, Vince, Warner and White and driver Gavid were killed instantly. Their section NCO, Lance Sergeant Button, was thrown some distance by the explosion, but the citation for Button's Empire Gallantry Medal states, although considerably shaken, he behaved with great coolness, collected the rest of his section at a safe distance, ascertained that none of them were injured, notified the first aid detachment and reported to his section officer by telephone. His was one of the last 4 Empire Gallantry medals to be awarded, because on the 24th of September 1914 it was superseded by the George Cross. And those 4 EGM holders were required to exchange their EGM for the George Cross. Not all of them did, which subsequently added value to their EGMs, of course. I think that all of the units mobilised from Aldershot returned back to the town after the war. And in 1947, national service was introduced for all men aged 17 to 21, initially for a period of 18 months. And that was increased to 2 years when the Korean War broke out. In 1959, the Royal Engineers training units for national service and regular recruits was moved to Southwood Camp. And in the early summer of 1964, I was posted from the Junior Leaders Regiment to complete my combat engineer training to Southwood Camp, actually in Morville Barracks, in one of the blocks, one of the spider huts down by the back gate, which is just up there underneath the word barracks. I think it was the left-hand spider I was in. They were quite comfortable, but I wouldn't like to have been in one in the winter. And I wasn't in it for long because I spent quite a bit of time in hospital. Right. In 1979, the regiment was amalgamated with 3 training regiment to form 3 RSME regiment at Gibraltar Barracks in Minley, and that is where they have remained. The camp was closed in 1979, and as ever, the sappers thought, how can we make a nice structure over our entrance gate? Well, actually, we'll grab a few Bailey Bridge panels and a transom, and there they are. Now, during this post-war period, new barracks were built, but there's little direct RE involvement in these developments. And in 1962, responsibility for the work service for the Army was passed to the Ministry of Public Buildings and Works. Suitably qualified RE personnel were often seconded to the MPBW, and it was sometimes referred to as the Ministry of Public Blunders and Wonders. We haven't given up on Bailey Bridge panels yet. In 1969, we used Bailey Bridge panels to construct the ski slope. Has anybody used it? No? Oh yeah, I can see your hand or two waving. Well done. It's still there and still serviceable. And then 3-2 Field Squadron built the Harrier ski jump for the 1978 Farnborough Air Show, which was used for the first public demonstration of the Fleet Air Arm Sea Harrier. This was constructing using Christchurch cribs with a braced steel deck, and the crib is probably one of the oldest pieces of military engineering kit still in its original form and still being used. And I was probably one of the first sappers to work alongside the Harrier in the form of the Hawker P1127 in about 1965 when it was brought down to Upnor again. We were laying out landing pads for it because we were responsible for providing temporary landing fields for it should they go to war. So, 1949 saw 9 independent airborne squadron RE move from Germany to Aldershot, and in 1963 they were housed in the original Gibraltar Barracks, which was due to be demolished. The RE Corps Committee agreed that a suitably worded plaque could be displayed on the site to commemorate the fact that the School of Ballooning, which was then a branch of the Royal Engineers, was founded here in 1892. Known for their panache, 9 Squadron wanted a suitably dramatic ceremony to mark their departure. Now, as luck would have it, the Royal Air Force had a balloon tucked away at RAF Cardington. So they were persuaded to bring it down, and on the 27th of March 1963, the final parade assembled on the balloon square. And Major Colin Gillespie, the squadron commander, then gave the singularly memorable order, "Captain Hill, take post in your balloon." Right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Thank you very much indeed.